Almost every American knows the name Benedict Arnold and knows it's synonymous with traitor. But the full story of Arnold's treachery isn't so well known. At least I personally didn't remember exactly what he had done to betray the United States, or that there was another key player in the plot. And his name was John Andre. Full transparency, I first became interested in this story because of the AMC show Turn, which is all about the Culper spy ring that operated during the Revolutionary War to provide information or intelligence to George Washington. In it, you get to eventually watch the Arnold plot unfold, and you meet this guy. Not only is he not bad to look at, but his character really interested me. So I am going to stop right here and say that if anybody is going to watch Turn, or if anybody wants to learn about the story in any way without spoilers, I'll say right here that this video will contain spoilers about the fate of certain characters. So, spoiler alert. In the description of this video, I am putting a bunch of links to documents and sources, and I really recommend checking them out. I have been down an incredible rabbit hole, and I hope you go down one as well. I would also like to take this moment to ask you to please give this video a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm if you find the video to be informational, educational, entertaining, what have you. So, this is the real Major John Andre from history. Born in London in 1750 to Huguenot parents, Andre was well educated. He was known for how he comported himself. Very kind, a gentleman, a Renaissance man who had talent and charm. He spoke multiple languages, he played instruments. This was a good guy by all accounts. And I mean all accounts. More on that later. So by 1779, Major John Andre was Adjutant General of the British Army and named Head of Intelligence for the British. He was a trusted officer under Sir Henry Clinton, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in America. And as part of his purview, he was responsible for getting intelligence through whatever means, whether utilizing spies or making overtures to certain high-ranking members on the enemy side. Enter Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is a complex, complicated character, and his backstory and motivations deserve their own exploration to truly understand why he did what he did. But the bottom line is, by 1780, Arnold was an American war hero, but a bit of a controversial figure who felt truly slighted and unappreciated by the side he was fighting for. He also had some money problems. But from the British perspective, Arnold seemed to be a powerful, potentially useful figure. By 1780, Arnold had made his decision to defect to the British side and was communicating with the British to talk terms. Arnold's point of contact was John Andre himself. At this point, Arnold had been put in charge of West Point, which was considered one of the most strategically advantageous locations of the war. So now Arnold had something useful to give them. He would give them West Point for a price. So in order to discuss the matters at hand and the circumstance of his defection, Benedict Arnold wanted to meet with Andre in person. And so it was arranged.
Welcome to the shore of the Hudson in Haverstraw, New York. Late at night on September 21st, 1780, John Andre was transported here via a sloop of war called the Vulture. The Vulture was a big ship, and from that ship he was rowed ashore right here to meet with Benedict Arnold to discuss their affairs. By the time they were done, it was too close to daybreak for John Andre to be rowed back to his sloop. So he was forced to stay the night. Unfortunately, it was technically behind enemy lines. The house where they stayed was owned by Joshua Hett Smith. That house, later nicknamed Treason House, has since been demolished, unfortunately. Today, a hospital is in the place where that once stood, but this would have been around where that house was.
While Andre was there, the American side had started shooting at the Vulture, still off the shore on the Hudson, forcing the ship to reposition farther downriver. This effectively stranded Andre, who would be unable to be rowed all the way to this new position. Now, Andre would be forced to walk back to British lines. He couldn't do this in his British uniform because it would be too risky. So he donned American civilian clothing and off he went, with documents concerning West Point tucked into his stocking, along with signed papers by Benedict Arnold granting him free pass under the alias John Anderson. It was all going according to plan until, with 15 miles left to go before reaching British lines, Andre was stopped.
Hello from Sleepy Hollow, New York. Sleepy Hollow is one of my favorite places in the world because every Halloween it comes alive with the spirit of the Headless Horseman. Even street signs have Headless Horseman on them. I love it. But today we are here for a different reason. We are here for John Andre. This is the place where John Andre was captured. And here in Patriots Park, there is a monument commemorating his capture.
On September 23rd, 1780, 3 American militiamen stopped John Andre as he was walking back to British lines here in Tarrytown, New York. Andre's answers to the men's questions raised some suspicion, and after searching his person, they found documents relating to West Point hidden in his boot. Documents they assumed had been stolen. He was promptly taken into custody, and the Arnold plot was subsequently revealed.
I have been here so many times and I never even perceived this all. It says, on this spot, the 23rd day of September 1780, the spy, Major John Andre, Adjutant General of the British Army, was captured by John Paulding, David Williams, and Isaac Van Wart, all natives of this county. History has told the rest.
The men who captured John Andre were lauded as heroes, having prevented catastrophe for the American side.
It's just crazy.
And as for Benedict Arnold, as soon as he caught wind of John Andre's capture, he fled safely to the British side, never to personally suffer any real consequence for his actions.
It just boggles my mind that up until recently, I had no idea who John Andre was. And after doing all of this research, it becomes very clear just how important John Andre's capture was. If he hadn't been found out, would the British have taken control of West Point? Would the entire outcome of the Revolutionary War be different? Who knows? But it's interesting to think about.
But he was captured. So here's the thing. Since Andre, a British officer, was found in civilian clothing behind enemy lines and carrying documents under an alias, he was to be tried as a spy. Andre was completely open and honest about what had transpired, maybe to a fault. He maintained that his actions really did not constitute spying. He had arrived in uniform, not technically behind enemy lines at that point. And when he was unable to be brought back to his ship, and his ship was shot at and driven away, he basically became a prisoner of war, and thus had the right to try to escape in civilian clothing. The other side did not see it that way.
I didn't even know this was here. I just happened to see a plaque from the car.
The Dutch church that stood at this location is where Andre's trial was held, and where he was found guilty of spying.
It was used as a military hospital and prison during the Revolution. The trials of Major John Andre as a spy.
The guilty verdict was submitted to George Washington himself for approval, who was staying here during the trial. Washington approved of the verdict, and on the manner of death by which Andre was to be executed. Back in the 18th century, spies were meant to be hanged. That was the death befitting a spy. Manner of death was important for people, especially for someone like John Andre, a true British officer. Accepting his guilty verdict, Andre still requested to be executed by firing squad rather than by the noose. But his request was denied, because to give him any death other than a death befitting a spy would mean that he wasn't really a spy. Rules were rules. André wasn't told about his method of execution until the day of. Up until that time, he was being kept at what is today known as the 76 House.
I kind of want to know if there's anything historical inside, if it's the same exact structure.
Hi, I'm just looking at the building.
Oh, yeah, that's fine.
Is this the original structure? I'm trying to read what that says.
Yes, 1686. You can come in if you'd like.
Oh, thank you.
I'd recommend stopping by just to see everything they have up on the walls.
That was pretty cool.
The British side desperately tried to save André from his fate, but the only real recourse would have been to trade André for Benedict Arnold. And how Washington would have loved to get his hands on Benedict Arnold. But to make such a trade was impossible. Technically, John Andre and Benedict Arnold were now on the same side, and to trade Arnold back would discourage any future defectors from the rebel side. So there was nothing to be done. As Hamilton said, Arnold or he must have been the victim. The former was out of our power. I want to stop here for a second to go back to who John Andre was as a person. And who can tell it better than those who knew him? The Marquis de Lafayette said, "All the court were filled with sentiments of admiration and compassion for him. He behaved with so much frankness, courage, and delicacy that I could not help lamenting his unhappy fate." Alexander Hamilton said, "His sentiments were elevated and inspired esteem. They had a softness that conciliated affection. His elocution was handsome, his address easy, polite, and insinuating. By his merit, he had acquired the unlimited confidence of his general, and was making a rapid progress in military rank and reputation." Once resigned to his fate, John Andre tearfully requested permission to send a letter to Sir Clinton on the British side, to allay any feelings of guilt Sir Clinton may have felt for André's untimely demise. And the day before his execution, André drew this self-portrait, which exists in Yale's archives. And so it was that John Andre was to be put to death on October 2nd, 1780.
Wow.
It's its own little section.
I thought this was gonna be in a park or something. It feels like we're in a residential driveway.
Someone's house?
The monument. Look at this quote. "He was more unfortunate than criminal, an accomplished man and a gallant officer. George Washington."
As Benjamin Talmadge, head of intelligence for the American side, recounted, "I walked with him to the place of execution and parted with him under the gallows, entirely overwhelmed with grief that so gallant an officer and so accomplished a gentleman should come to such an ignominious end." Blanching at the sight of the gallows rather than a firing squad, André said, "I am reconciled to my fate, but not to the mode." Then he composed himself and said, "It will be but a momentary pang." He climbed upon the gallows, put the noose around his own neck, a handkerchief over his eyes, and when asked if he had any final words, he said, "Nothing but to request you will witness to the world that I die like a brave man." He was 30 years old. His body was buried at this spot, underneath the gallows, until in 1821 when his remains were moved to Westminster Abbey in London.
Moved even his enemies to pity, and both armies mourned the fate of one so young and so brave.
If you're still with me, I want to thank you for watching this far. I know this has been a lot of information, and there are plenty more details to discover when researching on your own, but for me, this story makes me pretty sad for a number of reasons. I think learning more about John Andre helps to humanize the British side, who can tend to seem like sort of the bad guy when learning about the Revolutionary War. But there were people like Andre doing their best in service of their country. There were kind, compassionate, honest people involved on both sides. This story makes me feel sad for the British side, not just for losing Andre, but for losing him and gaining nothing. Benedict Arnold's defection did nothing for the British side. Nothing came from it. I even feel bad for Benedict Arnold, which may seem pretty ridiculous given that he betrayed the trust of those closest to him, but I tend to be frustratingly empathetic to anyone who is embarrassed or disappointed. Benedict Arnold, A, had no idea that Andre would die because of this, and B, even after his defection, Arnold was pretty universally disliked even by the British. And now American history remembers him forever as a traitor, and British history, correct me if I'm wrong, barely remembers him at all. So all of his effort, his anxiety, the sleepless nights he must have had, the pressure of pulling it off, the hope that the British would win the war so that he could be part of the winning side, all of that was for nothing. He gave the British nothing valuable with his defection. He lost the British their prized John Andre, and the British lost the war. I just feel bad how embarrassed, disappointed, knowing everybody hated him. It definitely helps being able to watch Benedict Arnold come to life in the show Turn with Owen Yeoman's portrayal of him, so that is probably where my empathy began. And again, I really recommend the show. But yeah, I think I just want to read a biography about Benedict Arnold. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. It took me forever to make because I kept learning more and more, and I'd find myself spending hours reading old documents and things. Again, check the video description. But here it is. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, follow me on Instagram, etc. And I will see you in my next video.